So let me just look. I know Zander's time is very precious. We've only got him for about an hour. He's got a hard stop, I believe at 10:30 our time. So we want to actually use him up as much as we can. To set the stage for this, I would just say that I work at BAMC, Brooke Army Medical Center, as a volunteer. I'm a volunteer provider there. I'm one of those old retired colonel guys that kind of hangs around with the ponytail, except they don't have a ponytail because it's the Army. You can't do that. But hang out there with and so anyway, they did a poll of our some, I think we have 100 and some behavioral health providers there, and out of that, the most, and this was back right after the political sort of uprising of late May, early June with the George Floyd death. They did a poll to say, hey, does everybody feel like where you at with the racial and ethnic and all those sort of issues? And the interesting thing is that the thing that people in this survey that they most had a problem with wasn't race, it wasn't gender, it wasn't those kind of things. It was crossing over this political divide, which of course you can imagine here in Texas is a fairly big deal. So so anyway, so out of that came this desire. So we talked with the steering committee, and they thought this was a good idea to have a topic on it. So the next thing that happened is I called Will, because I'm thinking I'm sort of a centrist, so I don't know a lot of people. So I called Will and I said, there has to have been some member out there who called you at some point and said, you guys are super liberal, I hate you, and slammed the phone down. I said, that's the guy we want to talk to get on the line. And then he pointed me to Matt, and I'm going like, and let me tell you, Matt is not that guy. So he's just a reasonable, amazing guy. You're just going to love Matt. But Matt comes from and I'll introduce him here in a minute, but he basically comes from a more conservative background, and he knows Zander. And so he says, hey, do you know Zander? I said, I don't know Zander. And Zander's our 2020 NASW Social Worker of the Year, who happens to be a trans man, and he's very familiar with the LGBT community. And these two guys are writing a book on exactly this topic. So I really should just shut up at this point and let them go. And that's kind of what we're going to do here for the first part of this. But they're just amazing. And I've had the great chance the last couple of weeks actually talking with them. And they're just amazing human beings, amazing social workers. Very proud to say I'm a social worker next to these two guys. So with that, let's just get started. And I'm going to, let's flip the slide here. So I think we overviewed it. Let's look at our poll real quick before we go into our rest of our part. I'm going to end the polling. I'm going to share the results. I'm really good at this, by the way. I think not. All right, so let's take a look at it. So the first question was, during this past year, have you had uncomfortable political conversations? And it looks like a lot of folks have had issues. It looks like the two big ones were with extended members and extended family members and friends, and upwards of 60%. So it's a deal. Number 2 says, which of the following social work values in the NASW Code of Ethics is the most important? So we had nobody loves service. Everybody hates service. Pay me. No, I'm just kidding. Social justice, we had a few. It looks like dignity and worth of the person is good. Yeah, 13% there. That's good. Importance of human relationships, integrity. And then we had 4 people that put none or all. And by the way, that's an important question.
Could you show the, Tony, could you scroll down so we can see the second and third question?
Yeah, I'm scrolling. Can you see it?
No.
Really? You can't see it?
Mm-mm.
Well, I'll tell you what, hold on a second.
Try scrolling it yourself.
Yeah, everybody can scroll it yourself.
Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you.
Okay, good. So we got that. Anyway, and this is going to be an important question later on, number 2, because we'll talk, Matt's going to talk pretty extensively about that as we move forward. So he and Zander are going to have some words about that. Which method do you believe is the best approach to political change? Interesting, about half advocacy and about half dialogue. I'm glad no one's in armed conflict. That was my job for 34 years. So I'm glad, that we hopefully are moving past that in our profession. Good thing. And then number 4 is, of the political system, where would you put yourself? It looks like kind of a nice scan with a little slightly skew, maybe towards the liberal side, but not bad. Kind of scattered across there. And it doesn't look like anybody's on the hard right. So Matt, you've got your work cut out for you. Convince those people that. Anyway, no, Matt's not on the hard right. But
yeah, we won't proselyte today. That's all right.
Yeah, that's good. Any questions about the poll? So like nice little kind of a scattering of things. So I'm going to stop the results. We'll shut that off. Hopefully it disappeared for everybody. All right, so let's do our panel discussion. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to pull up my little sheet here. And I want to introduce our folks. Hopefully everybody can see now. I'm going to try to get it going here. Okay, so let me formally introduce Matt and Zander. And then what I've done is I put together a series of a few questions to ask them. And again, these aren't questions they're not like, gotcha questions or anything like that. These are just questions that I think are kind of relevant to Matt and Zander, and that it helps to kind of open the dialogue for them. Once we're done with that, I really just want to turn the time over to the floor to have you guys ask questions of Matt and Zander. And Zander, you and Matt can also ask each other questions or dialogue between you. It doesn't have to necessarily come from the audience. So just kind of more of an open panel discussion. Anyway, so let me start with Matt. So Matt is the mental health advisor for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints missionary department. So I believe those are sometimes called the Mormons or the LDS faith. He received his bachelor's in social work from Utah State University and an MSW from Brigham Young University. He is a licensed clinical social worker and has provided therapy in a variety of settings for 24 years. He has been employed by LDS Family Services since 2000, where he has worked as a counselor and agency manager in Georgia, Arizona, regional manager in Arizona and Colorado, and a field group manager in the Southwest and Central United States, Mexico, and Central America. He was previously employed by Primary Children's Medical Center in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he provided therapy for abused children and their families. He started his career working with his wife as a group home parents for 45 troubled girls. That, Matt, that's like a 2-hour conversation right there. That had to be fun. Anyway, they've been blessed. They've been blessed with 4 sons. So that's great. And then the only other thing I would say about Matt is I think, and I'm just guessing this, Matt, that you're a return missionary from a Spanish-speaking country, because he noted that he is fluent in Spanish, which is pretty awesome too. So, but I want you to know, Matt, I'm working on my Duolingo every night on Spanish, buddy. I'm working it. So
hey, you're doing good. Anyway. You're doing great, Tony.
Anyway, Zander, go ahead. Sorry.
It's a bien hecho. Little Spanish for you there.
There we go. Anyway, Zander Keig, for the past 33 years, Zander has led and been involved in numerous LGBT-focused outreach, education, training, and community building and awareness efforts. As a trans man, he possesses firsthand experience and subject matter expertise in transgender healthcare, social care, and interpersonal and organizational conflict management, census organizing, clinical peer consultation, social work mentorship, emotional well-being program development, trauma-centered care, and moral injury. He holds a BA in speech and interpersonal communication, a master's degree in conflict analysis and resolution, and college student personnel administration, an MTS in theological systems and comparative theology, and an MSW in clinical social work. His awards include the 2018 California Social Worker of the Year Award, the NASW National 2020 Social Worker of the Year, and the top 50 successful transgender Americans you should know. There we go. All right. Anything I should add, Matt, Zander? You guys cover it? Did I forget something important?
Oh, that's great. That's great. Thank you.
The only thing I would add is that I am a first-generation American, Latino. My parents and my family is from Mexico, and I've been an NASW member since 2010. As soon as I was accepted to the MSW program, I joined NASW. So very happily have been involved since then. So.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, let's go with our first question. Gentlemen, and I wrote these down so I would get them right? Because otherwise, fog in the morning. Gentlemen, it seems you represent very different poles of the social work universe. Could you each take a personal issue or belief that would be either considered conservative, Matt, or liberal, Zander? Explain how you might use the 6 core values of the Code of Ethics, NASW Code of Ethics, and support your position. Let's start with Matt.
Okay. Well, I think it's important maybe to conceptualize a little bit of what conservatism or liberalism might look like in the United States of America. It is unique and specific to culture, to country. What's conservative in the United States is different than conservatism in another country. And so what conservatism may look like in the United States, I have a little screen that I'd like to slide, if I can just share that for a second. that might kind of create a little bit of a model for us. And let me just share this. So here, if you look left to right, the politically liberal in the United States may see things from a collectivist perspective more so than an individualistic perspective, where answers to social problems can be implemented on a national level, and then a state level, and then a municipality level, and then a smaller kind of community, such as a faith community or a club or a group, an interest group, and then a family, and then the individual. And one example of this, so liberals oftentimes read left to right, if you will. Whereas one way of conceptualizing conservatism is individuals who read right to left, and may take a look at the responses to social problems to some degree as an individual issue. That then if there's a need, turns to the family, to their interest group, sometimes their faith community or other things, then to a municipality, the state, and then the national level. So there's kind of a states' rights lean for the politically conservative in the United States, and even local governance to some degree, and individual governance. And so the principle that I'd like to maybe just address is a common one, such as unemployment. And in fact, I have a little film that I'll show here at the end of my explanation, if I can, because I think it's kind of helpful to see one response to unemployment and what that might look like. So let me just explain. Maybe one way of conceptualizing unemployment is to redefine it as not just unemployment, but employability. And so how do we enhance employability in an individual? We might start with helping them have experiences. It might be vocational training. It might be a degree or an education. It might be providing some type of service to an individual that focuses primarily on the individual. As we address social justice, we would want to make sure that they have, from a conservative perspective, equal opportunity to resources and experiences and opportunities that may help them along their path to becoming the person that they want to be, to help them find to enhance their employability. And so it's about opportunity and opening doors for those opportunities, and removing barriers to opportunity. And if there's a need for that, they would kind of proceed along that continuum, that they would engage their family. We wouldn't want to undermine the relationships between the individual and their family, or replace them or become a substitute for those family relationships. Family is the primary social fabric from a conservative perspective in society. And to the degree that we undermine or we interfere with that familial influence, it can sometimes have long-term consequences. The next principle is just seeing the person as a person and their dignity, and recognizing that they do have skills, they do have talents, and helping them to identify their unique skills and talents, and then connecting them with others. Again, I mentioned that earlier. We don't want to interfere with human relationships as we intervene, and as we intervene and try and help them develop their skills in the context of their relationships. We don't want to disrupt those relationships. Finally, next is just the principle of integrity. We want to make sure that we're helping them develop their own integrity and focus on their own integrity, not just our own, but their integrity as well. And recognizing that integrity invites integrity, that integrity is the foundation of trust, and to help them become trustworthy, help them have experiences that will do so. And then our competences in helping them build that. And if I can share with you just an example that I came prepared with today, let me just go to my browser here if I can. And this is just a brief story that I saw recently that I think spoke to this very well. And so I want to share it with you here. Here we go. And just notice as the right side of the spectrum is implemented in trying to help this person.
Hi, my name is Lori. 14 years ago, I was homeless and a drug addict. Thanks to Desert Industries, that is not who I am today. When I was 17, I joined the Air Force. After finishing my service, my mom, my dad, and my sister all had passed away. I was all alone. I had no real support system, and I had no one to turn to. I started using drugs. I became an addict and wound up in jail, which left me with a felony. After leaving jail, I was able to quit drugs, but I also became homeless and wound up living in my van. I saw myself as a felon and a failure, and it made finding a job very difficult. I felt hopeless. At one point, I even planned to end my life. A friend mentioned that I should look into working at Desert Industries. Right away, I knew this was where I was meant to be. DI gave me a chance when nobody else would. Not only did I have work, I also took the job search skills workshop. I started to feel more hopeful about my future, and I even started mentoring other associates. When I was almost done with the program, my apartment caught fire and I lost everything. And so they continued to let me work at DI. With their encouragement, I was able to take some classes at a local college, and eventually I became a full-time job coach. My favorite part about working at DI was that not once did anyone treat me like a felon or a failure, only as a fellow human being. I love working with the associates. It's because I can relate to them. I own my own home now. I cannot believe that in 9 years, I went from homeless to homeowner. I'm happy, and I love my life. Sometimes I think about the point in my life when I had planned to end it all, and how differently things could have turned out. My experience at Desert Industries saved me.
All right, so that's obviously a nice little example, but I think you can see from that by helping connect this individual with opportunities that came from a local community, from her to some degree from her faith community. The Desert Industries is a thrift store that is part of the larger organization that I work for, and she was able to have these experiences that ultimately I think embody kind of a conservative approach to social work, a right to left approach, if you will. Zander, take it away.
Thank you, Matt. You know, Matt, I just want to add, I don't know if I ever mentioned to you, but in the 1990s, I lived in Salt Lake City. That's many years before I transitioned. So I was a young, fairly radical lesbian at the time, and I fell in some hard times. And I did go to the local ward, and I talked with the bishop, and I was given a chit to go to Desert Industries grocery store and get a refrigerator full of food. And they also helped pay my rent for a few months. So I am forever indebted and grateful to the charity of the LDS Church. So I just want to mention that. I almost got a little teary. So it was a long time ago, but it still impacts me because it was a really difficult time in my life. So
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And thank you for the work that you do. I know how important it is. I'm married into a family that has some LDS members who went on mission, and so. So, you know, I like Matt's example of employment because my idea is similarly rooted because before I was a social worker, I was a case manager working for the Employment Development Department and Job Corps. So I'm sort of foundational, even as a social worker, in the dignity and worth of work. And I'm a huge promoter of the Clubhouse network that provides dignity and worth through work to people struggling or in recovery from mental illness. So if you're unfamiliar, please do look up Clubhouse International to get more familiar with them. But, you know, as a trans person, I want to center it on trans people, but I want to focus it on the employment issue particularly, because people may or may not know that there is there's an epidemic of unemployment and underemployment within the trans community. And that is not a result of lack of education and training. As a matter of fact, demographically, we're a highly educated and skillful community, but job discrimination, housing discrimination, lack of family acceptance are really at the root of some of the barriers and obstacles and challenges that trans people have, and large, that then contribute to this under and unemployment. And so what ends up happening is that some of the lowest wage earners, and primarily that would even be people who are surviving on what's called street economies, which is another way of saying perhaps sex work, are the most vulnerable and also the most visible to, you know, the least likely and supportive people. So then there's going to be a lot of violence that trans people are experiencing who are thriving at that level, or perhaps just surviving at that level of street economy, sex work, and homelessness. And so what I advocate for, and through my job and also through some of the nonprofits that I've been involved with, is that really what we do is we need to raise up the status of trans people. So we can do that through vocational training programs, through job placement programs, and there are sprinkled around the United States some programs like that are specifically trans, that have government dollars behind them, and they, you know, you can go and you can learn how to interview for jobs and where to get clothing for jobs and how to do a resume, and they have career fairs that are very specific to either LGBT community as a whole or the trans community more specifically, right? And so through that, trans people then can get access to the possibility of maybe moving into entry-level work, management training work, and rise out of that class of needing to survive on the street economy. And that will also then bring them income so that they can move into perhaps temporary housing and then transitional housing and hopefully permanent housing, right? That's the goal. And as a veteran who used to work at the Department of Veterans Affairs and Healthcare for Homeless Veterans, this was something that was foundational to our program, which was a housing first model, which most people don't know this, but Utah was one of the first at the statewide level to put into practice housing first model. So some good work coming out of Utah. And so a couple of things I'll add are that what we need to do then is advance access to housing programs, job placement programs, vocational training programs to trans people. And a lot of times that's going to be happening at that legislative level. As Will mentioned, there are some bills that are currently up for vote in Texas. I know in Florida, where I live, there are some similar bills that are particularly impacting trans people. So what we can do is make sure to advocate that there's equal access, right? We can't guarantee outcomes, but we can provide access to programs that are non-discriminatory. Because if people are surviving on the street economy level and they're insecure in their housing and in their employment and they're lacking family acceptance, the possibility of them thriving in society and in their own individual lives is going to be very difficult. And as a social worker, one of the things that I like to do, I'm a wellness consultant now, but a lot of the work that I do is focused on cultural and linguistic competency among behavioral health providers who are specifically working with the trans community. Because when we're working with people, if they come to your program, you might be more than happy and willing to invite them in and provide them services. But if you use the wrong language, the wrong terms, if you're not culturally competent, they may not return, and then they're going to remain, you know, in that underserved and underemployed or unemployed and street economy level. And so one of the things that we can do as social workers is increase our competency around understanding the trans community a little better, but also knowing that we'll never get it perfect. I'm trans and I don't get it perfect. The trans community is ever evolving and dynamic and very fluid in vernacular, in identity, in desire for what change is wanted. And so we have to be a bit flexible in when we work with that community.
All right, well, thank you. Can you guys both sum up again along the principles? So I think I understood. I certainly got what you got. I'm wondering, how did Matt and Zander, could you kind of frame your, and Matt, I loved your diagram. How would you then translate? What are the values for that kind of come to you know, how do you pull those 6 values together to come up with that position? And same, Zander, with you, you know, what are the, you know, what keys are you playing on to come up with that melody?
Yeah, great question. I think the important point is that you start with the individual and you see the inherent dignity of the individual. You strengthen their connections with their human relationships. You ensure equal access to opportunities through social justice. And then that forms the basis of your service. But you do so in you play by the rules. That's some degree of integrity, and the rules of the profession, the rules of the world that you live in. And if we need to you know, amend the rules, then we go through a process of amending the rules. And that comes through dialogue, through effective communication, through doing things that work. This, I think today, I hope it works. I hope it enhances our competence in being able to communicate and dialogue across differences. And I think when we do that, that's how we build those around us. So it sees value in collectivism, but it starts with the individual.
I mean, I could say the exact same thing using very different words, but I don't really feel the need to repeat, because I think what Matt said just sums it up exactly for me. He just frames it slightly differently, but I agree. You know, one of the things that, you know, we're here and we're talking about, you're talking left to right, right to left, and Tony, you introduced yourself and you mentioned that you were a centrist, and well, so are Matt and I, but people would assume I'm the liberal and he's the conservative, but we're all centrists, and we might have leanings perhaps, and we come from our centrism from many different, you know, influences and routes. But I think that's helpful for people to know too, is that you know, that's where we're positioned, and that we see these values as being integral to what we do as social workers, but also they're integral to my life, as how I live it and how I see other people, whether I'm in my professional role or my personal role, with my family, my friends, just out in the community. So I don't give any primacy necessarily to the code, you know, to the values in any really skewed way. But if I were to say which one do I take the position is where I start with people, it's definitely with that building relationships with human beings, with people, and in their own environment, not wanting to ascribe my own morals and values on them and what I think is best for them, right? And treating them with the dignity that they deserve, and coming from a competent place with integrity in all the service that I do, right? And so I think they're all very much interlinked.
Tony, if I could add something.
You know what? Yeah, please.
I just one thought is that currently in our culture today, one way of seeing this is through group identity. I think the typically conservatives see things a little bit more individualistic, where people on the liberal end of the political spectrum oftentimes see the importance of group identity and specifically advocating for groups who have currently or historically have been subject to oppression and have been subject to discrimination. And so that group identity is something that I think is important to understand, where sometimes on the political right, there's a little bit more, again, emphasis on individuals.
One thing, so this is kind of a question for both of you, and it's not on our list, by the way. It's not a got you question, but it's not on the list. But I because I think it's important. You guys are both centrists. You're both mature, well-grounded social workers. You've been in the profession a lot. But my guess is, you, just like all of us, you probably came from somewhere else. Could you take a little bit of time? And Zander, I know you spent a lot of time in the LGBTQ community, et cetera. And Matt, I know you probably raised LDS or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about your journey to centrism? I mean, how did you? And then maybe there's some touchstones that you can pull out to talk about how can we help our peers. Like a number of us are supervisors, et cetera. How can we help our folks to kind of come to a more centrist position, which I think it doesn't mean that we don't have advocacy, we don't work with the one, we don't cross the board, but that we're at least more in a centered position, so that we're able to reach across the aisle and do so. Let's start Zander, let's have you start and just tell us, how did you come to where you're at, and then is there any touchstones we can use?
Thank you for that question, Tony. Well, let me give you a brief overview of the journey. Right, so I'm almost 55, so I'll try and encapsulate this as briefly as possible. I was raised in Los Angeles, California, in a Roman Catholic Mexican family, so that's the underpinning. That's where my value system comes from. And although I'm no longer engaged or practicing as a Catholic, you read that people heard that I have a master's in theology, so I'm still engaged in spirituality and religion and theology at some level. And I never got from my family directly. I want to preface by saying my family was wonderful. They were accepting. I brought girlfriends to family functions. There were never any issues. Now, does that mean that I walked around, we were always in parks because the family was too big to be in a house, and you just can't whack piñatas indoors. So, we'd be outside, with our big potlucks, playing soccer and hitting piñatas. And so it's not like I walked around my family get-togethers, holding hands with my girlfriends or, making out with them, on some park bench somewhere. Absolutely not. I think that'd be disrespectful, and I would never do it. Right? That's just a value that I hold. None of my cousins did that, nor did my uncles or aunts. Like, maybe we're just not a very affectionate family, but none of that was going on. And it wasn't like I didn't do it because I thought it was wrong. It never even occurred to me to be that demonstrative of my, sexual orientation or my sexuality. So getting into more of a what I would consider like a far left community involvement did not happen because I was not accepted by my family or was experiencing persecution. I wasn't bullied in school, at least not for sexual orientation. I have disabilities that are not very obvious as an adult, but as a kid they were more obvious, and so I had bullying from that, but not around sexual orientation or gender expression or gender identity. And so what happened was I went into the lesbian community. I was 15. I went out looking for peers, and in the 1980s in Los Angeles, although there were probably many options to choose from, I fell in with a particular kind of lesbian community crowd, which would be, if people are familiar, which would be the separatist lesbians. Probably more well known as, quote, the man haters, right? So, which makes it even funnier that I'm a trans man, I think sometimes. But so that's kind of the community that I fell into, and so the politics of that community, the ideology of that community, was very, very. It was pretty harsh towards not only men, but also not just like straight men, but gay men too. We weren't very fond of the gay men necessarily within my network of friends and peers. And we also were not very, we weren't really kind to straight women either, or even lesbians who looked too feminine. I mean, it was just a little nutty. I'll just admit it right now. It was, you know, but I didn't know any better. I just thought that's how you were, that was what was to be a good lesbian. I didn't know any, I was 15 years old and I was hanging out with a lot of women who were in their late teens and early 20s. So I thought, well, they must know, right? And so I also went into the U.S. military. And so when you go, you know, as a female in the U.S. military, there are obvious issues that come up around sexual harassment that a lot of women experience in the military. I did not experience that, but that is something that happens. And so when I would be around other women in the military, that's the framing of the conversations would be around how difficult it was, what a problem everything was, how it was too hard for us, or right. And so I was in the Coast Guard, so maybe that might be a little bit of difference. Why, if I'd gone into the Army or Navy, I might have had more of the experiences that my peers were talking about in the military. But I found myself moving into, in the 1990s, becoming a leader within certain communities. And I don't mean leader on a national level. So what I mean is I started a Queer Nation chapter in Sonoma County, which is in the city of Santa Rosa. So Queer Nation was very popular in the 90s. It was started as the Pink Panthers, but I think there was the threat of a lawsuit for using the term Pink Panthers. So they renamed themselves Queer Nation. I was at the very first meeting that occurred. Well, at least the first public meeting. I wasn't a part of the organizing of that organization until I became a cell chapter leader in Sonoma County. But also I started two chapters of the Lesbian Avengers, one in Tucson, Arizona, and one in Denver, Colorado in the 90s. So I was obviously in a very radical place during the 1990s. I was also involved in an organization called Veterans for Peace, which was a very anti-military organization for veterans. And although I didn't persist into a lot of that real grassroots kind of activism work into the 2000s, I was still involved within, organizational work and advocacy work. And it really wasn't until I transitioned that things started to change for me. So when I started taking testosterone, about 2 or 3 years into it, when I was presenting to the world and being seen by most people that I encountered as a man, then people started to treat me very differently and have different expectations of me and very different assumptions about me, my character, my values, my contribution to the LGBT community. Right, I could just go on and on. My race all of a sudden became suspect. I had never been called white until I transitioned. I had never been called a racist or a sexist until I transitioned. And so all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, what's going on? And then I recalled, oh yeah, this is the kind of rhetoric I used to espouse when I was a separatist lesbian back in the 90s. Karma's crazy. And so what ended up happening was I started to question everything at that point. Like, okay, wait a minute. What are men and women actually experiencing beyond the anecdotal level, like what's really happening? And I started looking at Department of Justice statistics about who is more likely to be the victim of violence and what kinds of violence. And I just started looking at a bunch of different issues. And that led me completely out of that more radical work. I was also working at the VA at the time and with males almost exclusively who were homeless and with drug addiction and mental health issues with no family at all. And I was like, like, where's their privilege? I started to think of it in that frame of like, how did this happen to them? Why did it happen to them? Where are all these systems that are set up supposedly so that this doesn't happen to them? Why were they sexually abused as boys and sexually assaulted by military personnel in the military? And like I was just starting to question everything. And so that really was it. It was when I went through my transition and I started working at the VA with men experiencing very, very compromised life experiences that I began to go more towards the center, and that's where I've remained.
Tony, from my experience, I would just say that I believe that human beings are experience dependent in our development and in our maturation, and through research on epigenetics, we can see how how our experiences actually can change our actual DNA. And for me, I think social work is in my DNA. As you mentioned, I grew up from the cradle, member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I have ancestors who were driven out of different states and were oppressed because of their religious beliefs. And so just and because of that, they were very poor as well. And they had to learn and rely on each other and come together. And they migrated across the plains into Utah, where nobody wanted to inhabit that land. It was a barren wasteland, so they thought, and nobody could grow anything there. And there in the West is where my family has established. So Zander and I have quipped before that I'm kind of the paragon of privilege. You know, at least I look like it. The things that you can see, the things that are observable, but you don't know, you know, some of my ancestry, my background that invites compassion for those who have experienced oppression. You mentioned my mission experience. I did when I was 19 years old, served 2 years in Mexico, and I was in my first experience there was in a small rural village, and I was run out of town by a mob, and my life was threatened. And so, but I love those people. I established some great relationships there, and that 2 years of service changed me. Before that experience, I was an accounting major. When I went back to college, I really felt like social work was for me. And somebody said to me, "Hey, you know, you want to be," when I went to change my major, the advisor said, "Oh, you want to be poor the rest of your life, do you?" And I'll just tell you that I had this sense that, you know what, it's worth it. It'll be fine. It'll be meaningful. And I think that's something that made a change to me, is recognizing that meaningfulness is extremely important. And in any culture, in any when we're dealing with issues of identity and other things, meaningfulness is prime. And so that's something that also helped me. In terms of moving towards the center, I think just, if I could just be blunt, I've just always been around different people. Even though, you know, in Utah, there's a predominance of Latter-day Saints, there are a number of people of other faiths, and we love them. And they were some of my best friends. In fact, one of my best friends of another faith, he died in the war in Iraq. He was one of he was one of the few casualties of Desert Storm. And so I just learned from an early age just to bridge and to cross differences. Now, with NASW, just a few years ago, when I was in college and first couple of years after graduating, I participated in NASW, but I sensed that, you know, they were just much different than I, and they were oftentimes saying things that I didn't think were necessarily accurate, and then contributed to some division. So I left. A few years ago, I was encouraged to return, and I did, and I posted some things on a message board on the My NASW website. That's how I met Zander. And the question was, can somebody with conservative values be a real social worker? And it's a good question. And so I just watched it for quite a while, and then I posted. And if y'all are part of NASW, you can go in and see it. You can, I think it's still available. You can see the thread. But at that point in time, it was one of the longest running threads in the history of that board at that point in time. And that led us to this project that Zander and I have been working on, and where we're trying to promote viewpoint and political diversity in social work, because I think there's value in that diversity. And as I've found contributors, the more I find contributors, people who are willing to contribute to this work, to have interest in this, the more I just find great value in what we're talking about, that there's times to work from the right, there's times to work from the left, and we have to find our way together. And that's ultimately what led me to being here today with you.
Can I add something to that? I just want to give a little bit of a frame about this this bulletin board that both Matt and I were posting to at the time. So there were 3 different topics that got a lot of charge at the time. One was, can you be a conservative and a social worker? Can you be a Christian and a social worker? Which I found was really interesting because nobody was asking, can you just be religious? They specifically put Christian. And then I posed an invitation. I was looking for working with male social workers who were working primarily with men in their practice, private and agency work. And I got to tell you that I heard from the moderator of this whole thread that those 3 topics also received a lot of flags from, like, meaning they got reported as being inappropriate and offensive and all these things. And to the credit of my NASW moderators, they did not take down those threads. But when I posed about being a male social worker, wanting to work with other male social workers around their work with men, and that got reported and flagged, they notified me of that. And then the person who flagged me, in particular, one of the people that flagged it, didn't like the outcome, so then went and smeared me on Twitter. So, I mean, it's such an interesting occupation to be in, where, you know, even at a professional level, that's kind of how we are with each other. It's a bit disheartening, really.
Zander, I think it's tough, and I really appreciate you guys sticking it in there. Let me ask you maybe another question here. It says, Zander, social workers are called to political and social action, advocacy by our code of ethics, our training, and frankly, oftentimes by our own dispositions. Is there a difference between social work and social justice? And how does the NASW Code of Ethics give primacy to social justice?
Well, I don't believe
does it?
I do not believe that it gives primacy. I think that, you know, if they're all in a list, right? They're numbered, so that, you know, and social justice isn't the first one. So if it had primacy, it would be the first one in the list. I believe that advocacy can be a tool that's utilized by social workers at all different levels that doesn't have to rise to the level of political, right? You can be doing advocacy with families. You can do advocacy within your organization. You can do advocacy in your community. Some people choose to do advocacy that's of a political nature, right? With their city council, with their board of supervisors, with Congress. And I wholeheartedly support that work. I don't think that work is more social worky than my kind of social work, or Matt's kind of social work, or anybody else's kind of social work. I liken this to an age-old, you know, tension between mercy and justice work, right? This is biblical, right? It's like some people are working on making sure that people have a bed to sleep in and a blanket and warm food and a place to shower, and other people are working with their legislators to make more housing available and using the housing first model. And I think both of those are important. And we need each other, right? We can't just leave people on the streets until the laws change. And we can't just keep putting people indoors and providing them the resources and services without changing things at the higher levels. So I see they're equal in my eyes.
Matt, any comment?
No, I would agree that the code, and we'll talk about this later, the code actually explicitly states that there isn't one value that is given primacy. It's important. Social work isn't social work without social justice. At the same time, there's a harmonizing tension that comes within the application of the six values, the 6 ethical principles. And I just think that we need to be fluent. We need to be capable and competent in all of those principles. We can't ignore social justice issues At the same time, sometimes advocacy, the most important advocacy happens when you're advocating for an individual with their own family and helping the family to recognize differences and to dialogue across differences.
So I guess what you're saying, Matt, is sort of, it's like social justice for the one, or social justice at the family level, which can be very different oftentimes than social justice, you know, for the whole group.
Exactly. Exactly. They're arenas with each one of those different blocks, if you will, that I showed previously. But I think social justice is more than the national legislative things, that there are things that we can do on a local level as well that make a difference. And just you know, again, I just moved back to Utah recently. I've been in Arizona for quite a while. But in 2016, if you do a little Google search on the 2016 Utah Compromise, you can see how people came together, found common ground, and figured out a way to ensure that that the LGBTQ community was not discriminated in housing and employment and those kinds of things. I think there are just different ways when that is important that we do that work. At the same time, some of the most important work that we'll do is in the context of their closest relationships. And that is also social justice.
I'd like to add something really quickly to that, which is, I don't know that we're all on the same page as far as how we define justice and how we secure justice, right? So for some people, justice work is the building up, the expanding, the enriching. And for other people, justice work means to dismantle, to tear down, to destroy, to deconstruct, right? There's not a lot of compatibility between justice work that is building up and justice work that's tearing down. That's a very difficult bridge to pass. And I think that one of the benefits that I've come to recognize in Matt, and perhaps Tony, you share this with your own self, is that as centrists, we can be bridge builders, and we can be the people who liaison between, right? It's like, I can talk to conservative evangelical Christians because I can call on my theology training, my divinity school, training, and my years of navigating through religious communities, but I can also talk with LGBT people, right? So I've been able, and it's not just me, there are a whole bunch of, there's lots and lots of people who fill this space, and some are social workers and some are in many other occupations, or just doing this on a volunteer level. So I think we need people who have this, this fluidity in language, this cultural and linguistic. I see that as a part of competency.
That's great. And speaking on the note of, Zander, you just spoke a little bit about religion stuff. Let me ask you both a question about this. It says both of you have strong theological backgrounds, and social work as a profession is partially rooted in Judeo-Christian charity movement, that movement back the whole house and all that. Here in San Antonio, religious, government, and NGOs work very closely together to care for our poor, our less abled, and our needy. Is there a difference between social work and ideology faith? And if so, what are the differences from your various perspectives?
Matt, you want to try that one first?
Sure. So typically, when you're talking about faith communities, you're talking about faith communities that have a specific belief system, a specific ideology, if you will, or a specific approach. Social work, I think, is a little bit more broad. It invites and acknowledges differences, and that and it just acknowledge. I'm chuckling because I recognize that within my own faith that there are different groups or different entities or different people, and so I end up doing a lot of social work within my faith community, just like I probably do social work within my own family, but I think social work as a profession invites dialogue, invites connections with others. For me, in my own faith tradition, my faith actually partners with other charities, with for example, with Catholic charities or with Jewish Family Services, those kinds of things. I forget my apologies, I forget the Islamic organization entity that they partner with in helping with refugees and all kinds of things. But I think social work builds bridges between different entities, different faith traditions, different churches, if you will. But I also think that, to some degree, we all do social work within our faith tradition as well. So I think it's just more broad, but it can be applied in a variety of domains.
I definitely I concur with all that and have had those different experiences. I'll mention that in a lot of areas, there are interfaith organizations that work to provide housing and food and showers and access to identification cards and hair cutting, and they set up all kinds of compounds around the city, the county to do that. And there are a lot of social workers involved in that at the government level, from agencies. And so I see all of us working together very collaboratively. The difference would be if there are some religious organizations that before you can have a meal with them, you must pray with them. Before you can stay in one of their shelters, you have to sign a document, right? So that's different, right? And I would imagine that those kinds of organizations are not necessarily the ones that are involved in the ecumenical or interfaith efforts with working with people who are struggling, for housing and food and other, medical care, other issues like that. So I would much rather work with those organizations that don't require that somebody do a particular practice or sign a particular document or espouse a particular creed in order to get services. It's almost like holding food hostage, which I don't like that.
No, thank you. What I'd like to do is I looked over my questions. I think really I'd like to kind of just turn the time over, honestly, for some sort of dialogue from the audience and see what questions they've got. We've got about maybe 15 minutes before we have to stop, and Zander's got to go, and we'll take a break at that point. So I'd just like to turn it over to the audience and questions for Matt, Zander, both.
The one thing, Tony, you asked about was, what is the difference between social work and ideology and faith? And I wrote on the piece of paper where I saw that question, I wrote, or is there a discrepancy? Because that's really the issue that came up loud and clear on my NASW bulletin board, which is there are some people in our occupation, in our profession, who just don't believe that you can be a Christian. I guess you can be other faiths and a social worker, but definitely not a Christian. And that's a complete lack of understanding of the difference between, liberal evangelicals and conservative evangelicals and the different types of Protestant traditions versus Catholic. And so I think it just means, in my experience, when I've worked with people who have the strongest, because in LGBT community, it might not surprise people that there are going to be a lot of criticisms toward religion, right, towards faith communities because of people being excommunicated or people, being told that they're not welcome, right? So that happens. And, there's typically a problem if we want to have an LGBT event. If you have it in a church, usually there's going to be some pushback from people. And I understand that. And so, but to say that one cannot be engaged in a Protestant or Catholic, meaning Christian faith, and be a social worker, it goes so. I've heard people go so far as to say that Brigham Young University and any of the Baptist schools or the Catholic schools, they shouldn't even have accredited social work programs, which I'm like, wow, that, because I guess people don't recognize or perhaps remember that a lot of these charity programs that formed the foundation of social work in Britain and which came to the United States were church-based. It was because of the churches, right? And through the friendly visitor programs and the Hull houses. And so it's like, that is our history. That's not to say that there aren't issues that we should challenge that come up from, like in the 90s, the moral majority, right? clearly there are things, but it's like, what's happening now? How can we challenge things now? And how can we be more welcoming and open in our occupation to people? I mean, I want LDS social workers because I want them to work with their people. I want Jewish social workers. I want, like, not to say that you can't work across faith. That's not what I mean. But if there's going to be Jewish family service, wouldn't it be great if people got to have Jewish clinicians, and if there's LDS family service, that they got to have LDS practitioners, and Catholic charities, there were actually Catholic people working in those spaces. So I wholeheartedly support any religion or non-religion within our occupation.
Thank you, Zander. We've got two questions, first from Kristen and then from Heidi.
Hello. You have to forgive me. I have Fridays off and I am at home, not dressed up or anything today. So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I am a conservative. And I was finding, like, I belong to quite a few therapy and social work groups on Facebook, which share, resources and just knowledge and things like that. And one thing I was starting to experience is, if I had a diverse opinion or mentioned, conservatism or anything, I received huge backlash. And 2 times I had my license threatened. That people said they were going to call my licensing board, and conservatives do not have a right to be therapists, that anybody who voted for Trump is a racist and is a homophobe and all. I mean, so we're being blocked altogether. And I have people, that will laugh and say, there's no way that, conservatives can be discriminated against. Not possible. And I'll say that, other therapists will say that to me. And I said, well, if you don't believe that, go on to any therapist group and say, I am a conservative at the top, and just wait for the responses, because it is ultimate hate and it's horrible. And so I actually started a Facebook group for conservative therapists. And I did that one day, and I just waited. Like, I was like on pins and needles, and it started going bam, 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 bam. And we have about 1,000 members. Once in a while we'll get, like a troll in there, and it'll, it wreaks havoc. But it's our safe space, because we don't have a lot of safe spaces in this field. And people I think that most social workers believe that it's open season on conservative therapists because of all those things. We should not be therapists. We're racists, we're homophobes. And that's just, if you know any conservatives, like, really know them, that's not who we are. And all the conservative therapists that I know, we really care. And, we are very compassionate, and, we have a heart for people. And I wish we're experiencing the same thing that Zander was talking about when he, transitioned to male. I've heard that before from other, especially female to male people that transition, that all of a sudden they're this privileged white male. And then they start getting the same, type of rhetoric thrown at them. And I wish that, and social workers, we're supposed to be the most open-minded people of all. And I have found that to be unfortunately the exact opposite. Social workers are not open-minded. And if you do not believe like they are, you should not be a social worker. And so that's why I was so excited to see this. And I just hope that we can open up that a little bit more, because it's, to have your license threatened. And I've had, I actually lost a volunteer position of a place that I used to work. And I would go back and volunteer. I would get a lot of referrals from there. And someone found out that I was a conservative, called that facility or the organization, complained about me, and I lost that position because I'm a conservative. That was the only reason. And so it's like, why are we, that hurt my career. Yeah. Why? Yeah. So thank you for doing this topic. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm going to break in because I'm the one with the most time limit, but to say, thank you for asking your question. Thank you for being here. My wife is an LMFT, so I have a heart for marriage and family therapists. And I'm not on Facebook because, bless your heart, as you would say. Like, I can't even go anywhere near that toxic world. So good, keep up the good fight. Yes. Unfortunately, there's nothing to say other than yes, that's happening. I'll tell you, I woke up this morning to an inbox message on my LinkedIn. It's my only social media. This is a professional social media platform. I woke up to an inbox message and several posts on my profile, which I have deleted. Well, I reported the person and it's all gone. I woke up, all caps, "You're a transphobic piece of you know what, and I'm going to go after your license, and I'm going to call the NAS, or I'm going to go to the NASW and get you stripped of your 2020 Social Worker of the Year title." And I'm a trans man, and all I was doing is I was promoting that I had just recently become certified as a queer and trans affirming provider through an organization in Texas, by the way, that I'm now faculty of, that's made up of LGBT people and allies. So unfortunately, I know this is being recorded, so I'll watch my tone and my words. I'll be very careful. Not everybody in our profession and not everybody in my community has their bearings. I'll leave it at that.
Kristen, I'll just say that be confident, know your codes of ethics, and be clear about what you believe and why you believe it. And then you can articulate that clearly and in a very respectful way. And as you do that, I have great confidence that when you engage with social workers, that they will reciprocate. I'm sorry that hasn't been your experience to some degree, but to my experience to a great degree. And obviously there may be differences between us. Maybe that's my male privilege, if you will. But when I've spoken and when I've articulated clearly and in a principled way, the beliefs, the challenges, it's actually refined me. It's made me better when I've been challenged, not threatened. I'm not suggesting that it's okay to threaten, but when somebody has challenged me to articulate how somebody with conservative values could be a social worker, I had to go through the code of ethics, and I did a couple of times. And again, that's on that board where I explained how conservative values may align with the code of ethics, and how there's room for all of us, and we just need to find our way together.
One of the things I did, I also posted along with Matt that there are several places within the Code of Ethics where it lists different groups of types of people that we're supposed to be, quote, tolerant of, accepting of, offer services to, and it says political affiliation, I think, or something like that's part of our Code of Ethics over and over and over and over again. It's stated multiple times.
Exactly.
So,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. Yep. And
Yeah. Thank you, Kristen.
that seems to be what I
let's-
think. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yes, and Kristen, just so you know, I think Matt's gonna, in our second half of this, we'll have some more information. I think it'll be really helpful. Matt's got a little presentation. I think he's gonna help us out with that. Let's
Thank
go
you.
quickly to Heidi, because I know Zander's got.
Yeah, thank you. I just, first, I just want to say thank you for this conversation. I think it's really critical in social work. I'm a professor of social work, and I've been honestly just very concerned about this topic in terms of what has felt at times throughout my own education and just in academia in general, not specific to my university, but being part of these conversations, that we have to be really careful about the assumptions that we're making about where students are coming from, where our clients will be coming from. And I really appreciate the dialogue today. My question is, I was hoping to just gain some perspective from both of you around anti-racism, as that's one of the really big topics right now. And I think that I've been wanting to learn more around conservative approaches to this. And I appreciate what you said, Kristen, too. I think that, there's some defensiveness that's going to come up if we're name calling, using terms like even like white supremacy or white privilege at times, that I think we need to be mindful of how that language can elicit feelings of frustration or anger, or who's the most oppressed, and kind of this what has seemed like a need to argue which groups are the most oppressed, and then to come in with each of our own arguments about how I'm also oppressed, my family's been oppressed, you know, and I am concerned with what Zander's, you had said it well, and I like that, because around dismantling versus building bridges and building people up. And I've always taken the perspective that I want to bring people up. If there's privilege, that's a good thing. We want all people to have privilege. We want to bring people up, instead of we want to tear people down. And I think that you know, this is a pretty lengthy topic that, you know, has a lot of nuance, but I do think that there are assumptions being made around what is meant by the term anti-racism, and that this type of work and the same context could be applied to a number of other topics where we want to be bridge builders. I think I also identify as a centrist. So, you know, I would just love to hear thoughts on it from both of you. Thanks.
Sure. I'm not very familiar with what would be considered like the conservative take on anti-racism, other than what I've heard, which you could probably all listen to, that has to do with criticism of critical race and critical gender theory, right? So coming out of postmodernism. What I'll say, though, is that this idea of building up or breaking down, there's two basic models, right? There's a conflict model and there's a consensus model, right? When we're organizing, when we're working in whatever structure we're working in, right? And so the conflict model is primarily attributed to Saul Alinsky, right? He was a Chicago-based, you know, organizer, and he came up with, you can read his book, The Rules for Radicals, and it's basically conflict organizing. It's that model. But on the other side, we have a social worker, Professor Mike Eichler. He's now retired, who was at San Diego State University, where I got my MSW, and took his classes, where the Consensus Organizing Institute exists. And Professor Eichler was a protege of Saul Alinsky. He was trained by Saul Alinsky himself in the conflict model. And he went out into the community, and it worked until it didn't. And then when it stopped working, he started to look at, why isn't it working? Why did it work in that community, but not that community? Why did it work over there with those people, but not these people? Why did it work in that time period, but not this time period? And he came up with a different model called consensus organizing. And so you can get his book about that. And you can, you know, check out classes like this, you know, through the Consensus Organizing Institute. And so it's a very, very different way of organizing not just communities, but also organizing our families, organizing our homes, organizing our mind, right? Are we a conflict-based person, or are we consensus? Do we want to trample all over everything to get what we think is right? Or do we want to sit down at the table with as many people as possible and come to solutions together? And I think that if we can find a way to that, that's the route I take, and I will remain there. I will remain a centrist who is invested in consensus organizing.
Heidi, I would just add that there's a principle that I live by, which is seeking ye shall find. If I want to find certain things, I'll orient myself towards that. And so I certainly have an interest in combating racism. I'd like to find something that we could define as the opposite of racism, that we could actually move towards and help build consensus, help build equal opportunities for all, and decry any act of racism. I think we, to the degree that we can identify specific incidents and address them and deal with them, that I think has potential to do some good. When we talk about systemic things, our history is full of systemically racist things. At the same time, if we focus exclusively on the systemic, we may undermine self-efficacy and the belief that what I do matters and that I can make a difference in my own circumstances. If I believe that the world is tilted against me, that again can compromise. At the same time, we don't want to ignore, when the world is tilted, and try and create some balance. And I think that if we could create some consensus, I think that's a great model, and I'm eager to learn a little bit more about it. Zander, thank you for bringing that up.
You're welcome. I mean, somebody asked me just this morning, I'm really active on LinkedIn, so I'm referencing it multiple times, but somebody asked me on LinkedIn, like, what's been your one takeaway? Like, what's your life lesson? And I said, my life lesson is that I've learned is that no matter how insurmountable the external obstacles and challenges seem to be, the most difficult challenges and obstacles and limitations are the ones that we impose on ourselves, right? And so there's a lot of self-imposed limitations that we, like, for people who are especially in like psychotherapy and people doing case management, right? Making people get to a place, or not making them, but offering options for a different way to think about their own life, their own situation, what they have power over, what they don't have power over, what's within their means, what's not, right? And finding our way out of our own limitations, because I can tell you that those were the most difficult to deal with than the external, with all the internal, because we internalize so much that we get from outside. Oh, I'm not going to be able to get that far in life because, I was a high school dropout. Well, now I have 3 graduate degrees. Oh, I'm not going to be able to get that far in life because I was a special ed kid, who had brain damage, from a brain infection as a child. Well, I'm doing all right. I can walk now, even though I was paralyzed for 2 years, right? I'm not going to be able to get very far in life because, my family had disadvantages, so there's lots of ways that I internalize those messages that I had to overcome that. And so I say, I guess that's that right to left thinking, right? Is that it starts with me. It starts with me.
Well, I hate to cut it short. I think that's the last question. I know Doug had a question. Doug, are you still there? Did you have a quick question, or?
Well, I am here, and I know Zander has to leave. I did have a question that was probably a little more involved around some political ideology and that kind of thing. So happy to defer.
Okay, well, good. Apparently Zander can be reached on LinkedIn. So there you go. But please do not leave him please don't leave him an email bomb in the morning. That can be rather frustrating. You got to work up to those kind of things. Anyway,
I will put my email into the chat box if anybody wants to follow up. I love hearing from people, especially if you have found what I have said to be problematic. Like, I'd love to hear your views that are different from mine, and let's dialogue about things. But I just want to say thank you, because I do have to go in 1 minute. I want to say thank you for the invitation to be here, Tony, and thank you, Matt, for Tony, telling Tony about me and advocating for me. That's part of advocating for me to be on this panel with you. So I really appreciate it. It's been a joy. I've enjoyed, I've gotten some private messages in the chat box too. And so I've really enjoyed, hearing from the people that are participating. And just thank you, Tony, for all the work that you're doing. And Linda, I wish I could listen to your presentation, because self-care is it's so paramount. It really is. So thank you so much for that work that you're doing and bringing that into our world.
Yeah. Thank you, Zander. We really appreciate it. You're awesome. And remember, Texas is halfway between Florida and California. So when you get our way, come stop in, my friend.
I will be in Austin at the end of April. So
let us know. We'll come up and we'll have a Republican and a Democrat taco at Torchy's.
I'm in, definitely.
All right. Thanks,
Email
Zander.
me if you're in Austin. Bye-bye.
Okay, folks, let's take about a 10-minute break. 9 minute. We'll reconvene at 10:45 Central Time, and we'll see you all then. Well, it is looks like it is 10:45:36 according to the National Naval Observatory atomic clock. So I guess we will get started. Matt is here, and so what we're going to do at this point is I turn the time over to Matt. He's going to give us a kind of some philosophical background, I think, to maybe frame our discussion a little bit, and then I'll come on and kind of bring us home with some tools and techniques. And then following that, we hope to have a little question and answer, and then we'll have a little bit of a break right before we have to go into our award ceremony. So Matt. Wow, Matt. I mean, really, that's cool.
Hey, I do my best. I do my best. We'll keep it rolling here, right? Well, thank you, Tony, again for the opportunity, and it was fun to visit with Zander this morning, and hope that we can talk a little bit about maybe a basis for diversity, viewpoint, and political diversity in our practice. And I'd like to introduce to some of you a little bit about moral foundations theory. And I would be interested in knowing, just if I could, if you can raise your hand down there at the bottom of your screen, if you can see in the responses or the reactions, you can raise your hand. I'd be interested in just getting an idea of how many have had experience with are familiar with moral foundations theory. Just if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, it'll kind of give me an idea as to who may have some of those experiences. Well, looks like not too many, maybe just a couple. So this might be helpful, and I hope so. So as we talk about this today, I hope that you will participate, ask questions, and share some thoughts and perspectives, if you will. Let me see if I can move through here. Okay, so the moral foundations theory, give you a little bit of background on it. It was created by a number of social psychologists. It's not a social work theory per se, but it has implications for the work that we do. And Dr. Jonathan Haidt, when he was at the University of Virginia, currently he's at the Stern School of Business at New York University, I believe. And he, when he was at the University of Virginia, he grew up as a very liberal, secular Jew, and that's how he describes himself. And he was concerned about the number of conservatives around, and he approached the Charlottesville Democratic Party to try and figure out what's wrong with conservatives. And he kind of had this dialogue that went in, and this is, if you listen to Jonathan, you can see some of his work on YouTube and some other things. But he and a graduate student, they developed this questionnaire called the Moral Foundations Questionnaire. And I think it was in 2007, 2009, somewhere in there, they went to a conference with social psychologists. I believe it was in Memphis. And after the conference, they were having drinks and were around a number of other social psychologists, and they were all talking about the conference that day, and how there was quite a dearth of conservatives, and how awkward it would be with all the Bush jokes and jokes about conservatives, and those kinds of things. And they started to have a little bit of concern that they might engage in confirmation bias, and they started to acknowledge some of the challenges that come when we are in an ideological, I don't know if the bubble's the right term, but when we're not challenged in our thoughts and in our premises and so forth. And they created this project, and the project was they created a website called yourmorals.org. And if you haven't been there, it's kind of an interesting website. I'd encourage you to go. But they created this website. They took a look at, and they used the Moral Foundations Questionnaire, and they asked people to self-identify what their political leanings were, And then they did some correlations and looked at the response pattern between different moral foundations and their political leanings. And it was kind of an interesting, a pretty interesting experience. And what they learned is that political leaning correlates with different moral foundations. And there are some evolutionary psychologists and biologists who obviously, as they take a look at evolution and how that occurs, wonder if there might even be physiological bases for political leanings and moral foundations. So you might ask, well, what are those moral foundations? Well, in the first version of the Moral Foundations questionnaire, there were five moral foundations that were empirically supported. And so I want to maybe introduce those to you today, and hopefully we can have a little bit of a discussion here. The first is the care/harm foundation. This is the moral foundation that guides our empathy. This is the element of, this is the moral foundation that got me into social work, where I had an interest in helping and strengthening and blessing the less fortunate, if you will. And so that was, that's the first one, is the desire to avoid harming other people, and a desire to help others. It's that empathy gene, if you will, that many of us have. The next is the fairness versus the cheating foundation. We want to move away from cheating, and we want to create a fair world. And that fairness, obviously, Tony and I can attest that not everybody's blessed with the same hairdos or good looks or those kinds of things. Sometimes the world is unfair, and sometimes, and it naturally is. But that doesn't mean that we just surrender it and say we can't do anything about it. We try and facilitate fairness, if you will. Interestingly, they found later that fairness is something that I'll show you in a minute. The liberals, people on the liberal end of the spectrum, espouse quite a bit. That's a strength for them. But what they found later, as they continue to refine this, is that there are different types of fairness. Fairness from a liberal perspective aligns more with equality of outcome, and where fairness from a conservative perspective is about proportionality, and that you get what you receive, or you give what you get, if you will. And you get what you give. And so there's actually different takes on fairness. The next foundation is the loyalty or the betrayal foundation. This is one that emphasizes relationships. It emphasizes the importance of sacrificing your own interests for the good of others. Might emphasize things like patriotism. It might emphasize just an interest in being able of sacrificing for the greater good, or thinking of the greater good. The next is the authority or subversion foundation. This is a foundation that likes leadership and followership, that emphasizes public order, that legitimizes authority, and legitimizes his interest in kind of some social order, if you will. And then the fifth one is the sanctity foundation, which is a belief that some things are sacred, or some things are degrading, if you will. So an interest in honoring the body and not doing anything that would harm the body, or the interest in human life and not doing anything to harm a human life. There are different things that people consider sacred, and that sense of the sacred is a principle or a moral foundation, something that guides people's sense of what is right and what is wrong. And then this last one, those were the first 5 that they had discovered and used in the Moral Foundations questionnaire. But later they discovered another one, which is the principle of liberty and oppression. Liberty, that people have opportunities to pursue the things that matter most to them, and that they get to choose their own course, if you will. It's that this is the foundation that is activated when we do not like bullies or dominance or privilege, if you will. This sense that we've got to be mindful of those things that get in the way of people's rights and their liberties. So these were some different moral foundations that they identified, and what Dr. Haidt came to discover is that there were differences in how these political leanings correlated, and I'd like to share those with you, and then maybe we could have a little bit of question and answer, just a few questions before we move into another part of this discussion and what it means for practice. So what he found, and this is in his book, The Righteous Mind. That's a great book. I'd encourage you to read it if you haven't done so already. You can see in this chart here that there is the slopes for these different moral foundations. They slope in different directions. So you can see that the slopes for care and fairness slope from 4 to 3. The more that you move from the left to right. And the slopes for loyalty, authority, and sanctity slope upward, left to right. And what he found was that, and actually kind of changed him, if you will, is this awareness that people who lean liberal, they emphasize strongly the care and the fairness foundations, where those who lean politically conservative tend to value all 5 of those all 5 of those moral foundations. He describes this as different taste buds or different taste sensors. Just as we have 5 different types of tastes, he noted that if you lean politically liberal, that you'll have these two taste buds, this kind of sensitivity towards those two, whereas the conservatives had a little bit of an advantage, because if you wonder how on earth can a conservative ever win an election, it's because they actually are fluent in all 5 of those moral foundations to some degree. And they therefore are able to connect and engage people along all 5 moral foundations, albeit to a different degree. And that you can see that the lowest ones for the very conservative or the conservative are the care and fairness, and the highest are for authority. So social order, patriotism, those kinds of, or social order and predictability, safety, those kinds of things. And loyalty is also quite high, as well as sanctity. So to give you a little bit of a graph of what this might look like, the liberal moral matrix looks like this. And the sample size on this is incredibly high. There was a story in the New York Times that talked a little bit about the yourmorals.org, and after that story, their sample really exploded, and so they got a number of participants in this study from across the nation, of people who read the New York Times, and people like me who just read his book and then went and looked at that moral, my own moral matrix, if you will. And you can see that the care and the harm foundation is very strong. The liberty and the oppression is also quite strong with the liberal moral matrix, and the fairness and the cheating is also quite strong, but they are fairly fairly weak ties to the loyalty, the authority, and the sanctity foundations. Whereas the conservative moral matrix is fairly balanced, that across all 6 of those moral foundations, there was some consistencies in how, well, there's just some consistencies and some balance, if you will, and the ability to appeal to those different moral foundations. So he also shows in the book a libertarian foundation, and you can imagine what that looks like. It's you know, high on liberty, and relatively low on the other 5. So let me pause there just for a second and see if there are comments or questions or thoughts, any impressions, things that anybody would like to discuss or ask or share. If not, I can keep going. Does this surprise you, or does this align with kind of what you already maybe thought, knew, or believed? All right. Somebody says yes.
It looks like Heidi's got her hand raised. Heidi, did you have a question or comment?
Maybe that was from a previous comment.
Yeah, I'm actually on my phone, and so the controls are a little wonky. My apologies. I'm listening in. It's great. Thanks, Matt.
All right, very good. We'll lower your hand for you there. No worries. Okay. All right. Well, let me continue, and we'll talk a little bit about what this might mean for our practice as social workers. And let me just ask you, I'd like to maybe get your thoughts on, do you see how social work values and moral foundations might correspond here? So first, let's take a look at the service value. Now, I'll just repeat those again, and I'll ask you, and please you can press the space bar and just temporarily unmute yourself, or you can unmute yourself. I'd like to get your thoughts. Which of the moral foundations of care, fairness, liberty, sanctity, authority, and loyalty, which of those might apply to the service foundation of social workers?
I think care.
Yeah.
And maybe sanctity a little bit too.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Linda. Very good. Very good. And I would agree that care foundation is one that really drives that. You can see I think just some value to these moral foundations and how that drives a desire to serve. How about social justice? Which of those 6 foundations might apply to social justice? Again, care, fairness, liberty, authority, sanctity, loyalty.
Probably fairness, I would go with.
Yeah, very good. So fairness. Other thoughts?
I can see liberty being a tie-in.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. You can definitely see some relationship between those. So I would agree that care, fairness, and liberty kind of aligns with it. How about the next value, dignity and worth of the person?
Sanctity.
Yeah, very good. The sanctity of human life, that the human life is sacred, that it's important. Other thoughts?
Care also.
Yeah, definitely. Any other thoughts? Well, let's take a look there. I would agree that care, fairness, liberty, individual, valuing the individual liberties that people enjoy, and then the sanctity. Very good. How about importance of human relationships? Which one haven't we identified here that might come into play?
Loyalty.
There you go. Right on, Linda. That's right. So we see some some care and
Care.
relationships. Yeah, very good, Kristen. So there's, and that loyal, this is where I think the loyalty foundation shows up. This is where reciprocity shows up. This is where in a human relationship, in order for a human relationship to be sustained, there either has to be some type of dependency. In other words, you know, a parent-child relationship or a caregiver relationship, those kinds of things. But in a developmental relationship, there needs to be some reciprocity. So let's go to the integrity social work value. Which of these, again, which there you can kind of see a dimension that'll show up here now in these other moral foundations. This is where I think authority would actually show up, that if you lack integrity, you're going to lack the moral authority to have credibility amongst those that you serve. And really with integrity, I think integrity permeates all 6 of those moral foundations. And finally, competence. Which of those may correspond with the social work value of competence?
I'm thinking maybe authority to some degree, simply because there has to be an objective, evaluative process. You know, what is competence and are you there? So there has to be some kind of authority component to that. Very good.
Right on, Tony. I would agree. The competence gives you authority. If you're incompetent, or if you lack competence because of inexperience or other things, then you will lose your authority to practice and to work as a social worker. Any other thoughts about competence and how that may play into more different moral foundations?
I would see a tie into care. You can't provide care if you're incompetent.
Yeah. You may go in with a motive of caring, but if you're incompetent, sometimes you may actually harm. And so it's really important that we develop competence if we care for the people and the populations that we serve. It's important for us to develop awareness of what actually works and doesn't work in our discipline. So, and I would just add, again, care and authority. You know, those are 2 that seem to apply. So that said, I think what this does, to me, this is very valuable, because it gives, I think, credibility to the NASW Code of Ethics. As in terms of our discipline, it gives some guidelines and a little bit of a framework for the work that we do. And I would be interested in your thoughts on this. How do these moral foundations apply to different, how might being aware of these different moral foundations help you serve different populations?
This must be that therapeutic moment where everybody's quiet.
Yep. Give people time to think.
I know. Yeah. One thing I thought interesting, Matt, and may not directly play to the question, but I love how care is across all 6 of the social work dimensions. You know, means kind of at the base piece of our, as you noticed, as you mentioned, you came into social work because of your care and concern, and that's you know, that's really awesome that's kind of a base piece across all of our principles.
Yeah, it's innate. It's part of our attachment system, if you will, to see suffering in some way and approach it in different manners. Any thoughts on how this might be helpful to you in working with different people? So when you're, and specifically, if, you know, seeing how different people with different political orientations, you might wonder, well, you know, what are they thinking? Well, it might be that they just emphasize a different moral foundation that you do. And I think if we can ask people about the things that matter most to them, And I do this routinely in my practice as I look at values and as I understand the values, either the organizational values of the entity that I work with, the individual values of the people that I serve, the values of my colleagues. I can see that each one of them has a different different constellation of these moral foundations. I can also see that there are different things that drive people in their interest in social work, and that invite people to the profession for a variety of reasons, but almost universally, Tony, as you said, it's care. So let's talk a little bit about what this might mean for the NASW Code of Ethics, and specifically the preamble here. We'll jump into that. These are quotes from the preamble itself. And as we talk a little bit about this, and we recognize that there's very little research on the political constituency of the social work profession. There's hardly none. I've looked in a number of databases, and if you look at the political orientation or the political leanings of social workers, there's just a dearth. I'm curious about that. Why do you think that is? Why is there such a dearth of research on political leanings of social workers?
Matt, just a quick thought off the top of my head. My sense is, my bias is that diversity of political ideology is absent or very low in a whole bunch of organizations on both the right and the left.
Sure.
I think you'll see shared political ideology really dominate. But for me, the classic example would be within university faculty. My perspective is that there is very low diversity when it comes to political ideology. As an extension of that observation, then I think all organizations maybe are reluctant to examine diversity of political ideology within their organization, because it's self-serving, it's self-protecting. You start to examine it, and you may not like the outcome or the answers.
Interesting. Yeah, there's different things that draw different people into different realms and to different professions. And looks like, Doug, you got an endorsement from Heidi that she agrees with your perspective on that there is that it can be that there is a little bit of dearth in academia. And then Heidi, I think it's a good point that it may be unpopular to research. The only one that I could find was a study from back east, and as Will mentioned this morning, social workers in different parts of the country probably vary in their political identification and so forth. But I think that social workers typically do lean left, and I think that's understood, because there is an interest in looking out not just for what's working in a society, but looking out for the little guy, looking out for the marginalized, the disenfranchised, and the oppressed by what may be working. And so it might be my hypothesis might be that it's not researched, because it would be like, asking for the obvious. And I think it is quite apparent that our profession does lean left. But let me go into it and highlight how the Social Work Code of Ethics actually emphasizes things that might appeal to the political right as well. Linda makes a statement also, yeah, definitely more active in the legislative process. Very good. That's a great point. Let me, if I can, we'll go through some of these things that are stated in the Code of Ethics that kind of create a little bit of balance, if you will. The NASW Code of Ethics preamble, it states it provides the context for our work. A historic and defining feature of social work is the profession is focused on individual well-being in a social context and the well-being of society. And so the interesting thing there is that principle of social context, person in environment. And so while we may live in an environment that has a history of racism, bigotry, and oppression in many ways, it is contextual. We have to understand that context. As I have explored and had conversations with people about the context, the discussion around privilege, one of the things that, and I would entertain a discussion at this point in time about the concept of privilege that some have spoken, I've heard some social workers speak about privilege as though it were innate and inherent and unchangeable, where my observation and my critique is that I believe that privilege is oftentimes contextual and it's dependent upon the social context. And I could be wrong, and I'm open to that, but as I've discussed this with a number of people who have studied it and relatively young social workers, to be honest with you. I mean, this has kind of been more of a discussion in relatively recent times in academia, this issue of privilege. I haven't got a clear understanding of how it's universal and it's not necessarily contextual. Would anybody like to share your thought on that, whether privilege is contextual or whether it is universal? And it's okay to share differences. I hope we can model and experience what we're talking about today, and in sharing differences. You're not going to hurt my feelings if you disagree. Well, we won't take that as an endorsement. We'll just take that as or maybe we could, it's okay to recognize that privilege is sometimes part of the social context. I do believe that is important, that we see privilege in terms of context, because if we see it as innate or inherent, then why try? It undermines, again, self-efficacy. Whereas if we can see that privilege, if we define privilege in negative tones, that rather than trying to extend privilege to others, if we speak about privilege in a shaming way, shame doesn't sustain. Shame just, we've seen that in a number of ways, in a number of dimensions of our lives. But if we can see that if you believe that white privilege exists, and I certainly can see contexts where it does exist, well, how about if as social workers, we try and extend the circle of privilege rather than restrict it or simply attribute it to a single group, if you will. The next principle that I wanted to emphasize from the preamble is that social workers seek to enhance the capacity of people to address their own needs. So a principle of self-reliance that gets a lot of talk on the right is actually part of the Code of Ethics, that we try and help them meet their own needs. That's something that we can speak, I think, across the political spectrum to some degree, to the degree that people can. The third thing.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah,
Matt,
please.
I just wanted to break in here. I think it's an interesting thought, and this fall is for our ethics piece. We're going to be talking with a community organizer. So he's a person that's done a lot of community organization, kind of grassroots level stuff. But the interesting thing about it is he has what they call the iron rule. So they have this. So within the organization community, and I'm talking about the Saul Zelinsky guys way back, they have a principle called the iron rule. And the iron rule is never do for someone what they can do for themselves. And I just find that so fascinating that even within organization, the importance of helping individuals to then become efficacious is critically important. And so I just thought that was interesting that even from the far left, there's this principle of making, helping people help themselves.
Beautiful. Again, we're finding common ground there. We're looking at people who approach things from a different way, but there's some common interests there. And I think self-reliance is a little bit of a misnomer, because I do believe that, you know, sometimes we see self-reliance as this do-it-yourself kind of a mentality. But I think a conservative approach to self-reliance is a little bit different, where it's not necessarily dependence. It's not necessarily kind of this toxic independence either, where you're just kind of doing your own thing and you're fighting against, you know, normativity. That there's this respect for authority, this respect for the social order can create this awareness that there is some normativity. But the nice thing about having friends on both the right and the left is that the left, our left friends will advocate for those who don't necessarily feel quote, normal, or that there be some type of normativity. So I think there's just some awareness of those things. And again, doing things for other people that they can't do for themselves, that's part of care. But doing things for them that they can do for themselves can foster that dependence. I think social work is ultimately about this interdependence rather than this toxic independence or, you know, fostering dependence. I like that principle that you just shared, and I think it's something that speaks to people across the political spectrum. Tony, I will say as well that as I've listened to some anti-racism initiatives and speakers and listened to some podcasts and so forth, I've noticed that a number of them emphasize we need to envision a world where our services are no longer needed. You know, that is a great point. You know, they're trying to envision and reimagine that world rather than, again, creating dependence. I think they're speaking in a language in a way that could appeal to somebody across the political aisle if, you know, we cease to see things in a left-right way, and we can just start to see people as people. Let me go to the next element here, the purpose statement of the NASW Code of Ethics. It states that specific applications of the code must take into account the context in which it is being considered and the possibility of conflicts among the code's values, principles, and standards. And this is interesting. We hope we didn't set you all up at the beginning of with the poll question. It says further, the NASW Code of Ethics does not specify which values, principles, and standards are most important and ought to outweigh others in instances when they conflict. And this one's really important because again, as I've interacted with many different social workers, many of them were brought to the field by the social justice emphasis. And as we've talked a little bit about primacy, are any of the values given primacy? Well, the code itself says no. There is not one that's given primacy. Social work isn't social work, again, without social justice, but there's a difference between social justice and social work. Social work is a broader application than simply a social justice initiative. And if we were to give primacy to those social justice to social justice initiatives, we have to decide which of the other 5 would we sacrifice. Would you sacrifice service? Would you sacrifice dignity of human life? Would you sacrifice human relationships, the importance of human relationships, integrity, or competence? The beauty of the code is that it has this harmonizing tension when there's different times when you need to apply all 6 principles. Now, as we go into ethical principles, this is where it gets kind of interesting as well. There's an interesting nuance here. Again, people who lean left oftentimes emphasize equality of outcome, where people on the right typically emphasize equality of opportunity. And I think if we can recognize that both are important, but we have different ideas or different thoughts about how to achieve them and how to go about them. Here, it says that social workers in the value description of social justice, it actually has a note that suggests that it actually is a little bit more of a conservative definition of social justice. in that it emphasizes equality of opportunity. You see that in the very last sentence. Social workers strive to ensure access to needed information, services, and resources, equality of opportunity, and meaningful participation in decision-making for all people. Now these are the ethical standards that Zander referenced in his presentation, where he was talking a little bit about the ethical standards that emphasize political belief and religion. That's part of the Code of Ethics. In order for us to practice effectively, I believe that it's important for us to understand all 6 moral foundations and to become fluent in those moral foundations so that we can speak to people with different political beliefs or religious beliefs, and but also in those other elements as well. We need to understand and be respectful of people's race, their ethnicity, their national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, age, marital status. We mentioned those 2, immigration status, and mental or physical disability. I think our social workers, those of our profession, really do a nice job of addressing all of those other elements. It's our hope today that our work will bring about a greater emphasis on viewpoint diversity and political diversity in social work. Again, here it is that, you know, it's instantiated in the Code of Ethics that we need to be respectful of our colleagues' political belief and religion. That's in the Code of Ethics, in addition to those other things. And then the broader society, this is social workers should engage in social and political action that seeks to ensure that all people have equal access to resources, employment, services, and opportunities they require to meet their basic human needs and to develop socially. Social workers should be aware of the impact of the political arena on practice and should advocate for changes in policy and legislation to improve social conditions in order to meet basic human needs and promote social justice. Now, this is interesting. One of the very last paragraphs of the NASW Code of Ethics, this is the only time that I could see equity, which we don't always get clear definitions currently in terms of equity. Equity means different things to different people, but equity is commonly understood to be an equality of outcome. And this is the one time in the Code of Ethics that equity is mentioned in the second to the last paragraph. And then finally, that we, on a broader society, not just amongst our clients and nor amongst our colleagues, but that we respect all of those differences. So again, political diversity is an important part of the Code of Ethics, and we should be careful about being critical, disparaging, or creating dominance of one political ideology over another. So if we could, I would just recommend that we recognize and appreciate moral foundations. That's my hope, that this presentation today will help with that. That we learn to communicate and engage different moral foundations. We increase our fluency. We don't marginalize, oppress, nor dismiss different moral foundations or different applications of those different moral foundations. And that we develop self-awareness, so we recognize our own preferences and fluency in different moral foundations. There are certain moral foundations that I'm certainly more fluent in than others, and I hope that I want to work on some of the other ones where I'm less fluent. We want to also be cautious about giving primacy to any particular moral foundation and value. And finally, we want to learn to engage all values within the Code of Ethics, that we find balance in our application of the different values within the Code of Ethics, and that we respect and honor that harmonizing tension, that social work really is a chorus of different voices and different principles, so that we become a self-actualized and optimized society without leaving people behind, without marginalizing and oppressing others. If I could suggest a brief recipe or formula of what I believe is effective social work, it's balance, it's interdependence, and it's also growth. But we can't grow at the expense of others. If we can help others grow, and there are different ways that we can talk a little bit about that. Sometimes capitalism gets spoken of disparagingly. Sometimes family does. Sometimes democracy does. But all of those things are the worst type of their family's the worst type of social environment, except for all the others. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And capitalism is the worst, economic model, except for all the others. There's problems in each of them, but rather than dismantle them, if we can find ways to work together to strengthen the different entities within, we can find that balance, that interdependence and growth. Thank you. See, there's one other comment here. Thank you, Dan. Very good. Excellent. Tony, that's the conclusion of my remarks at this point of our training.
Sounds good. Matt, you want to unshare your screen?
Oh, you betcha. Sorry about that. I'm dominating and oppressing you.
Oh, no problem. No problem. Okay, well, we've got about 30 minutes left. Here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to show a short video. It's a TED Talk video that I think kind of wraps up. I think it's about 8 minutes, but I think it kind of puts a nice wrap on kind of what we've been talking about. And then that'll open us up to maybe about 10 minutes of dialogue to discuss if there's any questions for Matt or conversation we want to have. And then we'll take about a 10-minute break so that we'll be ready at 12 o'clock noon for the beginning of our award ceremony. So with that, let me tell you, I don't know what my bandwidth is, so this may be a complete disaster. I'm going to give it the best shot I got, and we'll just go with that. So let me give it a shot here. If I can figure out how to do this. All right. Obviously, I don't know. Hold on. It just did a great thing by shutting the folder that had the thing in it. How's that? So I have to go find the folder. Good grief. Here we go. Aha. Okay, here we go. All right, I got the presentation up. Back over here.
I'm a political and social psychologist. I study how people understand the world and what this means for society and for democracy, which, as it turns out, is quite a lot. Some people see the world as safe and good, and this allows them to be okay with uncertainty and to take time to explore and play. Others are acutely aware of threats in their environment, so they prioritize order and predictability over openness and experimentation. In my academic research, I study how these two approaches shape how we think and feel about everything from art to politics. I also explore how political elites and partisan media use these very differences to engender hatred and fear, and how the economics of our media system exploit these same divides. But after studying this, I have come away not with a sense that we are doomed to be divided, but that it's up to us to see both sets of traits as necessary and even valuable. Take, for example, two men who have been so influential in my own life. First, my late husband, Mike. He was an artist who saw the world as safe and good. He welcomed ambiguity and play in his life. In fact, we met through improv comedy, where he taught improvisers to listen and be open, and to be comfortable not knowing what was going to happen next. After we got married and had our baby boy, Mike was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And through months of hospitalizations and surgeries, I followed Mike's lead, trying to practice being open, trying to be okay, not knowing what was going to happen next. It was Mike's tolerance for ambiguity that allowed me to survive those months of uncertainty, and that helped me explore new ways to rebuild my life after he died. About a year and a half after Mike passed away, I met my current husband, PJ. PJ is a criminal prosecutor who sees the world as potentially good, provided that threats are properly managed. He also is someone who embraces order and predictability in his daily routine, in the foods that he eats, in his selection of wardrobe. And PJ has a vicious wit, but he's also morally very serious with a strong sense of duty and purpose. And he values tradition, loyalty, and family. Which is why, at the age of 28, he did not hesitate to marry a widow, adopt her baby boy, and raise him as his son. It was PJ's need for certainty and closure that brought stability to our lives. I share these two stories of Mike and PJ not just because they're personal, but because they illustrate two things that I have found in my own research. First, that our psychological traits shape how we engage with the world. And second, that both of these approaches make all of our lives possible. Tragically, though, political and economic incentives of our media environment seek to exploit these differences, to get us angry, to get our attention, to get clicks, and to turn us against one another. And it works. It works in part because these same sets of traits are related to core political and cultural beliefs. For years, political psychologists have studied how our psychological traits shape our political beliefs. We've conducted experiments to understand how our psychology and our politics shape how we respond to apolitical stimuli. And this research has shown that those people who are less concerned with threats, who are tolerant of ambiguity, these people tend to be more culturally and socially liberal on matters like immigration or crime or sexuality. And because they're tolerant of ambiguity, they also tend to be okay with nuance, and they enjoy thinking for the sake of thinking, which helps explain why it is that there are distinct aesthetic preferences on the left and the right, with liberals more likely than conservatives to appreciate things like abstract art or even stories that lack a clear ending. In my experimental work, I've also found that these differences help explain why ironic political satire is more likely to be appreciated and understood by liberals than conservatives. On the other hand, those people who are monitoring for threats, who prefer certainty and closure, those tend to be our political, cultural, social conservatives. Because they're on alert, they also make decisions quickly and efficiently, guided by intuition and emotion. And we found that these traits help explain why conservatives enjoy political opinion talk programming that clearly and efficiently identifies threats and enemies. What is essential, though, is that these propensities are not absolute. They're not fixed. There are liberals who are monitoring for threats, just as there are conservatives who are tolerant of ambiguity. In fact, PJ's political beliefs are not that radically different from those that Mike held. The link between psychology and politics is contingent on context, who we're with and what's going on around us. The problem is that right now, our dominant context, our political and media context, actually needs these differences to be absolute, to be reinforced, and even to be weaponized. For reasons related to power and profit, Some in politics and media want us to believe that those people who approach the world differently from us, the Mikes or the PJs, themselves are dangerous. And social media platforms use algorithms and micro-targeting to deliver divisive messages in our preferred messaging aesthetic, messages that relate to politics, culture, and race. And we see the devastating effects of these messages every single day. Americans who are angry and fearful of the other side. Charges of the other side destroying America. But stop and think for a moment. What would happen if those differences had never been weaponized? It is liberal inclinations towards openness and flexibility that allow us to cope with uncertainty and that allow us to explore new paths towards innovation, creativity, scientific discovery. Think of things like space travel or cures for diseases or art that imagines and reimagines a better world. And those conservative inclinations towards vigilance and security and tradition, these are the things that motivate us to do what must be done for our own protection and stability. Think of the safety that's offered by our armed forces, or the security of our banking system, or think about the stability that's offered by such democratic institutions as jury duty, or cultural traditions like fireworks on the 4th of July. What if the real threat posed to society and democracy is not actually posed by the other side? What if the real danger is posed by political and media elites who try to get us to think that we'd be better off without the other side, and who use these divisions for their own personal, financial, political benefit? Mike and PJ engaged with the world very differently, but these distinct approaches continue to enrich my life every day. Instead of our political and media context determining that the other side is the enemy and lulling us into believing that that's true, what if we choose to create the context? Real people connecting with other real people, appreciating these two approaches for what they are, necessary gifts that can help us all survive and thrive together. Thank you.
Did that come across for everybody, or is that just me watching a video?
Was great.
Good. Excellent. Okay. Well, I hope that kind of sort of summed up maybe some of the thinking that Matt and Zander and I sort of brought to this presentation. And of course, there's a lot more dialogue to be done. It doesn't just take place in this room with us. It doesn't just take place within NASW, although it's a great place to start, but it's going to take place across our families, across our community, across our professions, across our client groups, as we begin to kind of look and value each other. But I think a great, and Matt and Zander and I have spoken about this, that we social workers uniquely bring to the table some of these skill sets and some of these values, as Matt has so adequately shown us this morning. So, using those values and those kind of, that training that we've had, it puts social workers in a unique position to be able to, really kind of try to moderate and try to work with other people as we work forward on this. We've got about 15 minutes. I'd like to take about 10 minutes of that though for a break. So let's give about maybe 5 minutes of questions and answers. And while we're doing that, I'm going to put the link to the evaluation for this morning's piece. So that's myself, Matt, and Zander, the ethics across the political divide. And I'm going to put the link in the chat for the form. If you'll go there and just quickly take about a minute and a half and just give us some feedback, we'd really appreciate that. And I'll pass that on to Matt, etc. So go ahead and ask some questions and I'll go ahead and post that.
Kristen, go ahead.
So my question is, do you think that that what I fear is that the social work and the ethics will I don't know how long ago they were changed, but they will continue to be changed so that conservatives are kind of more pushed out because of the specificity of the ethics, that they could become so specific that we are not able to practice that. I mean, that's my ultimate fear. I don't know if that, would happen, but what are your thoughts about that, and how can we create some change maybe to open up some of the dialogue about this?
Tony, if I can respond, I think it's a good question, Kristen. I've had others ask about it, and I don't think my experience with the NASW's with NASW is that while they lean left, there's certainly some interest and openness to viewpoint diversity and political diversity as constituted in the Code of Ethics. If the NASW Code of Ethics did that, it would marginalize a number of people who would leave the NASW leave NASW and go to form another entity. There are other social work entities out there that would appeal. NASW does not necessarily have legislative influence. It doesn't have statutory influence. I believe in most areas. I don't know of any area that it does. And so if it were to take that turn, I think it would be to its own demise. And that is one reason why I'm doing this, why we're participating in this project, is because we want social workers to expand our influence. We don't want to shrink it so that it's the National Association of Social Workers who only appeal to certain moral foundations. We would like to expand the social work tent rather than reduce it. And I think they share that interest. They've been very cooperative with me, very respectful. I've never, as I've engaged them and engaged people within NASW, generally speaking, it's been very, very good.
Charlotte, for me, I would just say, and I mirror everything Matt said. I think here's the real problem: is that you can't. I think of the world like a kite. Matt and I have spoken about this early on in our discussions. That if you've ever flown a kite, and it's March, and so now it's great kite flying time. You have the kite itself, which pulls up. As you pull it into the wind, it goes up. But the problem is, if you've ever flown a kite without a tail, it flops all over the place and eventually crashes into the ground and burns. I mean, I've done that a few times, so I know. But I think it's the same way. We pretend like, a tail is not going to get airborne, and a kite without a tail cannot stay airborne without crashing. We have to have conservative, values and viewpoints. We have to have liberal values and viewpoints, because without that, we cannot get a stable kite off the ground and keep it stabilized in the air. And so it really requires us reaching across the political spectrum, and it's just like we need white voices, and we need black voices, and we need Hispanic voices, and we need female voices, and we need transgender voices. We need all the voices at the table, because if we don't have those, we're missing a piece, and more importantly, we could crash the boat. So part of this is I think it would not be in not only NASW's best interest, population wise, size of people, but it's just that you cannot maintain a stable organization. I mean, Matt talked very clearly about the importance of conservative values and loyalty and sanctity and all that in maintaining organizations that help other people. If we don't have those voices at the table in NASW will in itself come apart.
Tony, if I could add something, as I've seen comments on the NASW board, those who are saying that we don't need NASW are those who are not looking for order. They're not looking for an organization. They're the, those who want to do their own thing. And so I'm not seeing that from the right. I'm seeing that from the left. Also, those who are feeling oppressed by NASW are those who typically are on the left, because they have some difficulty passing the people who are feeling oppressed by it. We're having some difficulty passing their licensure exam. And so order itself has an appeal to that authority. So I just think that the need for organization and authority does appeal to conservatives as well.
Well, we're getting really close to the end of the time. Is there any other last minute one question? Hope everybody had a chance to fill out their evaluation. I'll post it again in the chat. Matt, I really want to appreciate and say thank you so much for your time, especially during your vacation. Tell your wife I owe her dinner if you guys ever get to San Antonio. I deserve, she at least gets that. But we really appreciate it. And again, not only having the conservative perspective at the table, but I think I value so much your reasoned, principled voice at the table, because I think, and I know you're centrist, slightly to the right maybe, but the point is, I think we need to have these centrist left and right voices like Zander, et cetera, to be able to have these dialogues to discuss this, because there isn't a choice. I mean, we can't take the nation apart. We can't hate each other. We can't, otherwise we'll end up in some African or South American looking civil war. I think we have to fold the end pieces in. Not that there won't always be radical voices at the table, but we have to have some semblance of centrism, or we'll wreck the ship.
Thanks, Tony. I'd agree. And if, we are working on this project. If anybody has interest in contributing, we have voices from across the political spectrum. We are promoting viewpoint and social and political diversity in social work, and think we'll be better off because of it. So thank you, everybody.